Imagine this. You're standing in front of a problem that seems insurmountable. It could be an illness, a financial crisis, a broken relationship, or a fear you've been carrying for years. You look around searching for a way out, a solution, something that gives you hope, but nothing changes. You feel weak, you feel powerless, and a voice inside you whispers, "You can't, you're not strong enough, you won't make it." But what if I told you that's the biggest lie the enemy wants you to believe? Because inside you there's something bigger than any problem, stronger than any fear, more powerful than any circumstance. A power that doesn't come from this world, a power that comes from God. And here's the question. How can you unleash that power in your life? Throughout history, the Bible shows us that ordinary men and women with fears, weaknesses, and flaws achieved extraordinary things when they allowed God to strengthen them from within. People who faced giants, walked through fire, defeated armies, endured trials, and came out stronger. Do you know the best part? That same power that transformed their lives is available to you today. But there's something else you should know. God doesn't impose his power on you. He offers it. But you must learn to receive it, to trust him, to let go of what limits you, and hold on to his strength. So stay until the end of this video, because today you'll discover how to unleash the spiritual strength God has placed within you. And when you do, everything in your life can change. Now, let's begin with the first story. The story of David and Goliath isn't just a tale of bravery. It's proof of how spiritual strength can make the impossible possible. Picture the scene. Israel's army is paralyzed by fear. Day after day, a nearly 3-meter tall giant named Goliath comes out to the battlefield and challenges anyone who dares to face him. His armor shines under the sun, his voice thunders. No one dares to step forward. But then, a young shepherd appears on the scene. David isn't a soldier. He has no armor, no sword. He only has a sling and 5 stones. But he has something more powerful than any weapon. He has faith. David looks at the giant and says something that will change history. "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin. But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel." At that moment, God's power is activated in him. David doesn't see the giant's strength. He sees as God's power. He doesn't focus on fear. He focuses on God's promise. And with a single move, he launches a stone, hits Goliath in the forehead, and brings him down to the ground. A young man with no military experience just defeated the most feared warrior. How did he do it? David understood a truth that can change your life today. True strength doesn't come from what you have in your hands, but from what you have in your heart. David didn't trust in his ability. He trusted in God, and that made all the difference. Now, stop for a moment and think about this. What is your Goliath? Maybe it's not a physical giant, but it could be an internal battle, fear of failure, anxiety that paralyzes you, the pain of a past you can't let go of. What if instead of looking at how big your problem is, you start looking at how big your God is? David didn't win with his strength. He won with the spiritual strength God gave him. And that same strength is available to you today. If you trust in God like David did, the giants in your life will fall. But this is just the first story, because there's something even deeper you need to hear. The next story will show you that no matter how weak you feel, God can use you in ways you never imagined. Imagine God calling you to do something great, something beyond your ability. But there's a problem. You don't feel strong enough. You don't feel prepared. You see yourself as weak, insignificant, lacking what's needed to fulfill that purpose. Does that sound familiar? That's how Gideon felt when God called him. The Bible tells us that in Gideon's time, Israel was oppressed by the Midianites. They were cruel invaders who destroyed their crops, looted their goods, and made them live in fear. The people of Israel were hiding, hopeless, powerless. And in the midst of all this, we find Gideon. Where was he? Not on a battlefield, not in a leadership position. He was hiding, threshing wheat in a wine press, a place where grapes were normally trampled to make wine. Why? Because he was afraid. Gideon wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a leader. He was an ordinary man, afraid, just trying to survive. But then, something amazing happens. An angel of the Lord appears to him and says, The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Imagine Gideon's confusion. Mighty warrior? He didn't feel brave. He felt weak, incapable, and his response says it all. But Lord, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. Do you see what's happening here? God calls Gideon mighty warrior, but Gideon sees himself as the weakest. Have you ever felt like that? God tells you you're strong, but you feel weak. God tells you you have a purpose, but you see your limitations. God calls you to do something great, but you find 1,000 reasons why you're not enough. But here comes the key. God didn't see Gideon for what he was at that moment, but for what he could become with his power. And God sees you the same way. He doesn't focus on your weaknesses. He focuses on what he can do in you and through you. The story continues, and although Gideon doubted, although he asked for signs, although he struggled with his insecurity, he ultimately trusted God. And with just 300 men, he defeated an army of thousands, not by his strength, but by God's power in him. So here's the great lesson. It doesn't matter how you see yourself. What matters is how God sees you. And if God says you're strong, that you have a purpose, that there's power within you, then it's true. Don't let fear stop you. Don't let doubts paralyze you. God wants to do great things in your life, but you need to trust him. Now, do you want to know what to do when circumstances crush you and you feel there's no way out? The next story is for you. Imagine being in a situation where everything is against you. You've done the right thing. You've stood firm in your faith. But instead of seeing blessings, all you find is opposition, rejection, suffering. It seems God has forgotten you. What would you do? Many give up. Many doubt God. But there's a story in the Bible that teaches us something powerful. The story of Job. Job was a righteous man, a man who feared God and lived according to his commands. He had a prosperous life, a beautiful family, wealth, health. But in a single moment, everything changed. He lost his possessions. He lost his children. He lost his health. His body was covered in painful sores. His wife told him, "Curse God and die." His friends, instead of comforting him, told him he must have sinned, that all this was his fault. Job was at the lowest point of his life. If anyone had reasons to doubt, to give up, to say, "God has abandoned me," it was him. But here comes the incredible part. In the midst of his pain, in the midst of his despair, Job said something that would change history. "But though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." Job didn't understand what was happening. He had no answers. He saw no way out. But still, he chose to trust God. And here's the lesson for you. There will be times in life when you won't understand why you're going through certain trials. There will be moments when everything seems dark, when you'll feel God is silent. But it's in those moments that your true strength is revealed. Because true spiritual strength isn't trusting God when everything is going well. It's trusting him when everything seems to be going wrong. Job stood firm, and in the end, God restored everything he had lost and gave him double what he had before. But the most important thing wasn't the material restoration. The most important thing was what Job discovered in the process. He discovered that God had never abandoned him. He discovered that his faith didn't depend on his blessings, but on who God was. And here's the question for you. When trials come, when life hits you, will you keep trusting God? Because if you do, if you stand firm, you'll discover a strength within you that isn't broken by circumstances. You'll discover that God's power in you is greater than any storm, and that will change your life forever. But there's more. The next story will show you how prayer can unleash supernatural power in your life. Imagine you're trapped in an impossible situation. There's no way out. There's no help. Everything indicates the end is near. What would you do? Many would panic. Others would give up. But in the Bible, we find a story that shows us that when all seems lost, there's a key that can open any door. Prayer. This is the story of Paul and Silas in prison. Paul and Silas were preaching the gospel, doing God's work, but they were unjustly arrested. They were brutally beaten. They were chained in the darkest, coldest part of the prison. They were in pain, with open wounds, in a dirty and hopeless place. Most people in their place would have fallen into despair. But Paul and Silas did something no one expected. At midnight, instead of complaining, They began to pray and sing hymns to God. Yes, in the midst of pain, in the midst of injustice, in the midst of prison, they chose to worship. And something amazing happened. As they prayed and sang, suddenly, a great earthquake shook the prison. The doors flew open. The chains of all the prisoners came loose. God had answered. But here's the most incredible part. Paul and Silas didn't escape. Instead of fleeing, they stayed and spoke to the jailer, who upon seeing God's power, fell to his knees and asked him, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And that same night, the jailer and his entire family believed in Jesus and were baptized. Here are two great lessons. First, prayer is power. No matter how dark your prison is, no matter how great your chains are, when you cry out to God, doors open. Second, sometimes God uses your trial to bring salvation to others. Paul and Silas could have fled, but they stayed because they knew their mission was greater than their pain. So think about this. What chains do you need God to break in your life? What prison has kept you trapped? Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's anxiety, fear, hopelessness. Whatever it is, today you can do what Paul and Silas did. Instead of complaining, start praying. Instead of giving up, start worshiping. Because when you do, God's power is unleashed in your life. But it doesn't end here. The next story will show you how faith can make you see miracles in the most difficult moments of your life. Imagine facing a crisis where everything seems to be against you. Your logic tells you there's no solution. People around you say it's impossible. But in the Bible, we find a story that teaches us that when all seems lost, faith can change everything. This is the story of the woman with the issue of blood. For 12 years, this woman had suffered from an illness that constantly weakened her. She had spent all her money on doctors, but none could heal her. In her culture, her condition made her unclean. She was rejected. She lived in loneliness, without hope. But then she heard about Jesus. She heard that he healed the sick, gave sight to the blind, performed miracles. And something inside her awakened, an unshakable faith. She knew she had no right to approach Jesus publicly, but she decided she would do the impossible. She pushed through the crowd with effort, with pain, with the certainty that a single touch would change her destiny. And when she finally reached Jesus, she stretched out her hand and touched the edge of his cloak. At that instant, she felt her body was healed. Her faith had activated the miracle. But here comes something amazing. Jesus stopped and asked, "Who touched me?" His disciples were surprised. There was a crowd surrounding him. How could he ask who had touched him? But Jesus knew it wasn't just any touch. It was a touch of faith. The woman, trembling, confessed what she had done. And Jesus, instead of rebuking her, looked at her with love and said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Here's the most powerful lesson. Her healing didn't come because she touched a cloak. It came because she believed, because she had a faith that defied circumstances. And that same faith is available to you today. Maybe you've been struggling with something for years. Maybe you've heard there's no solution, that there's no hope left. But Jesus is still the same. And when you approach him with faith, miracles happen. Now, I want you to think about this. What would happen if you started to truly believe? If, instead of focusing on the problem, you focus on God's power. If, instead of accepting defeat, you took a step of faith. Because when you do, the impossible becomes possible. But there's one more story you need to hear. A story that will show you that even when you feel you have nothing, God can multiply the little you have and do something extraordinary. Imagine you're facing a huge need. You look at what you have in your hands, and it seems insufficient. There's no way it could be enough. But the Bible shows us that when you put the little you have in God's hands, he can multiply it in ways you never imagined. This is the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus was teaching a huge crowd. 5,000 men, not counting women and children. They had spent the whole day listening to him. But now they were hungry. The problem was that they were far from the city, in a deserted place. There was no food for so many people. The disciples looked at the situation and said, "It's impossible to feed so many people." But Jesus challenged them with a question. "How much food do you have?" They searched through the crowd, and only found something small, 5 loaves and 2 fish, a child's lunch. But instead of complaining about how little they had, instead of doubting, they decided to give it to Jesus. And this is where the miracle happens. Jesus took those loaves and fish, gave thanks, and began to distribute them. And what was insufficient began to multiply. Every person in the crowd ate until they were satisfied. And when they gathered the leftovers, they filled 12 baskets, more than they had at the beginning. Here's a powerful teaching. God doesn't ask you to have much. He only asks you to give him what you have. Maybe you feel you don't have enough faith. Maybe you think you don't have enough talent, enough resources, enough strength. But when you give God the little you have, he multiplies it. And what seemed insufficient becomes abundance. No matter what your need is today, no matter how small your capacity is, if you put it in God's hands, you'll see how he works in your life in a supernatural way. Now, think about this. What's in your hands today? What is that small thing you can give to God? Maybe it's your time. Maybe it's your service to others. Maybe it's a seed of faith. Put it in his hands and watch how he multiplies it. But there's still more. The next story will show you how trusting God can allow you to walk on water, even when life storms try to sink you. Imagine you're in the middle of a storm. The winds are strong. The waves are crashing furiously. The sky is dark and there's no land in sight. Your boat is small, fragile, and it seems like it could sink at any moment. Fear overwhelms you. There's no escape. But in the Bible, we find a story that teaches us that even in the midst of the worst storms, God calls us to walk above the waters. This is the story of Peter walking on water. The disciples were in a boat in the middle of the sea when a strong storm arose. The wind was violent. The waves threatened to capsize the boat. Suddenly, in the darkness, they saw something that terrified them. Someone was walking on the water. They thought it was a ghost. But then they heard a voice. It was Jesus. He told them, "Don't be afraid, it's me." And at that moment, Peter did something incredible. Instead of staying in the safety of the boat, he said, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus responded with a single word, "Come." Peter, with faith, stepped out of the boat and put one foot on the waters. And something impossible happened. The waters, which should have swallowed him, held him up. Peter was walking on water, defying all logic. But then he made a mistake. He took his eyes off Jesus and looked at the storm. He saw the wind. He saw the waves. And fear entered his heart. At that instant, he began to sink. Desperate, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And at that very moment, Jesus stretched out his hand and held him. He lifted him up and said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" They got into the boat together, and at that moment, the storm calmed. Here's a profound lesson for your life. Storms will come. The wind will blow. The waves will crash. But if you keep your eyes on Jesus, you'll walk above the waters. The problem isn't the storm. The problem is where you fix your gaze. If you focus on the problems, the difficulties, the fears, you'll start to sink. But if you focus on Jesus, he will hold you up. He won't let you drown. And even if at some point you doubt, even if at some point you feel you're falling, you just need to do what Peter did. Cry out, "Lord, save me." And he, without hesitation, will stretch out his hand and lift you up. Now, I want you to think about this. What storms are you facing today? What winds are hitting you? God is telling you the same thing he told Peter. Come, dare to trust, dare to take that step of faith. And you'll see how, instead of being drowned by circumstances, you walk above them. But there's still more you need to know. The next story will show you how, even in the darkest moments, God can take what seems like defeat and turn it into the greatest victory. Imagine everything in your life falling apart. You fought, you believed, you've done everything possible, but still, it seems you've lost. You feel defeated. But in the Bible, we find a story that shows us that when everything seems finished, God is just getting started. This is the story of the cross and the resurrection. Jesus has spent 3 years preaching, healing, performing miracles. Crowds followed him. People believed he was a Messiah. But then everything changed. He was arrested, beaten, humiliated, He was brought before Pilate, unjustly accused. The same people who had once acclaimed him now shouted, "Crucify him!" And finally, they took him to Calvary. They placed a crown of thorns on his head. They nailed his hands and feet to a cross. They lifted him up naked, shamed, bleeding. And he, in his agony, looked to heaven and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Jesus died, and with his death, the hope of many died too. His disciples hid, full of fear and sadness. People thought it was all over, that the Messiah's story had come to an end. The enemy thought he had won. But what no one knew was that God was about to do something that would change the world forever. 3 days later, when everything was silent, when the tomb remained sealed, when soldiers guarded the sepulchre, something supernatural happened. The stone was rolled away. The soldiers fell to the ground, terrified. And Jesus, who had been crucified, came out of the tomb with glory and power. Death couldn't hold him. The enemy couldn't defeat him. Jesus had risen, and with his resurrection, defeat became victory. Fear became faith. Sadness became joy. Hopelessness became salvation. Here's the most powerful lesson. Sometimes in life, it will seem like everything is over, that there's no way out, that the tomb is sealed. But with God, the story never ends in defeat. He has the power to resurrect what seemed dead, broken dreams, destroyed families, wounded hearts. When all seems lost, God can do something new. Now I want you to think about this. What area of your life seems to be in a tomb? What thing have you given up for dead? God wants to remind you today that the cross wasn't the end, that the tomb couldn't hold him, that if he conquered death, he can also conquer any situation in your life. Trust in him, because the resurrection isn't just a story from the past. It's a reality that still transforms lives today. But there's still more. The next story will show you how God not only changes your destiny, but also gives you an eternal purpose. Imagine you spent your whole life searching for a purpose, searching for answers, trying to find what truly gives meaning to your existence. You've tried hard, explored different paths, but something is still missing. Nothing seems to fill that void in your heart. The Bible shows us we weren't created by accident. God designed us with a purpose. And one of the most powerful stories about this is the transformation of the Apostle Paul. Paul, before knowing Christ, was a persecutor of Christians. His name was Saul. He was a religious man, convinced he was doing right by persecuting Jesus' followers. He arrested them. He imprisoned them. He was even present when they stoned Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Saul thought he was serving God, but he was actually fighting against him. Until one day, everything changed. He was on his way to Damascus, seeking more Christians to arrest. But suddenly, a light from heaven shone brightly. Saul fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Terrified, Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice responded, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Saul was blinded by the light. For 3 days he couldn't see. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. It was a time of darkness, of reflection. God was working in his heart. And then a man named Ananias was sent by God to pray for him. When Ananias laid hands on Saul, something like scales fell from his eyes. Saul could see again, but not just with his physical eyes. His heart had been transformed. From persecutor, he became preacher. From enemy of Christ, he became his most passionate follower. God gave him a new purpose, showed him he was created for something greater. From that moment, he left his old life behind. He traveled the world preaching the gospel. He suffered persecution, imprisonments, beatings, but he never turned back because now he knew who he was in Christ. Here's the lesson for your life. Maybe you think you failed too much, that you made too many bad decisions, that there's no hope for you. But God doesn't see your past. He sees your purpose. If he could transform Saul, he can transform you. If he gave Paul a new purpose, he has one for you too. Maybe you don't understand it now. Maybe you don't see the path clearly. But God already has a plan, a purpose that goes beyond what you imagine. You just need to trust. You just need to surrender to him. and he will show you what you were created for. But there's still more. In the next story, you'll discover how God uses even the most difficult moments of your life to fulfill his purpose in you. Imagine you're going through a difficult trial. You feel like everything around you is crumbling, that every effort you make seems in vain. You wonder why God allows you to go through this suffering. But let me tell you something. God never wastes pain. And one of the most powerful stories about this is the story of Joseph, Jacob's son. Joseph was a young man with great dreams. God had shown him visions of greatness, but his brothers envied him, hated him because their father loved him more. Until one day, their hatred turned to action. They took him and sold him as a slave. Joseph, the young man with great dreams, suddenly found himself in a foreign land with nothing, no family, no hope. But God was with him. He was sold to a man named Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh in Egypt. And though he was a slave, God gave him favor. Everything he did prospered. Potiphar saw this and put him in charge of his entire household. It seemed Joseph's life was improving. But then another test came. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. Joseph stood firm and said, "How could I do such wickedness and sin against God?" But she falsely accused him, and Joseph was thrown into prison. Again, it seemed all was lost. But even in prison, God was with him. God gave him favor with the prison warden. And there, Joseph interpreted the dreams of two prisoners. One of them was released and restored his position in Pharaoh's palace. Joseph asked him to remember him, to speak for him. But 2 years passed and no one remembered him. It seemed his life was stuck in suffering. Until one day, Pharaoh had a dream no one could interpret. And the man who had been in prison with Joseph finally remembered him. They called Joseph. He interpreted Pharaoh's dream and gave the solution to save Egypt from a great famine. Pharaoh, impressed, made him governor of Egypt. The slave became the most powerful man in the country, second only to Pharaoh. But the story doesn't end there. Years later, the famine reached his family's land. His brothers, the same ones who sold him into slavery, came to Egypt seeking food. They bowed before him, not knowing it was Joseph. And when Joseph revealed himself to them, instead of taking revenge, he told them something incredible. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Here's the lesson. God used every difficult moment in Joseph's life to fulfill his purpose. What seemed like injustice, betrayal, tragedy was actually part of God's plan. Maybe today you don't understand why you're going through what you're going through. Maybe you feel betrayed. Maybe you feel forgotten. But I want you to remember this. God never wastes pain. If you keep trusting him, he will use every tear, every trial, every suffering to bring you to the purpose he has for your life. Joseph went from slavery to the palace, from prison to government. God can do the same with you. What seems like failure today will tomorrow be a testimony of God's glory in your life. But there's still more. In the next story, you'll discover how unshakable faith can bring supernatural rewards, even in the darkest moments. Imagine facing a situation where everything is against you, where being faithful to God means losing everything. What would you do? Would you stand firm or give in to the pressure? The Bible tells us the story of 3 young men who faced this test and saw God's glory in a supernatural way. Their names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were Hebrews taken captive to Babylon. And though they were in a foreign land, they never stopped serving God. But then, King Nebuchadnezzar did something that tested them. He commanded that a gigantic golden statue be built and issued a decree. When the trumpet sounded, all the people must bow down and worship the statue. It was an absolute order. Anyone who refused would be thrown into the fiery furnace. The trumpet sounded, and all the people bowed down, except 3 people. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remained standing. They refused to worship the statue. The threat didn't matter. The punishment didn't matter. They knew only God deserved worship. When the king heard this, he was furious. He summoned them and gave them one last chance. He said if they bowed, they would live. But if not, they would be thrown into a fiery furnace immediately. Then he asked them a challenging question. What God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Their response became one of the most powerful declarations of faith in the Bible. King, we don't need to answer you about this. Our God who we serve is able to deliver us from a blazing furnace and from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we will not serve your gods or worship the golden statue. What unshakable faith. They knew God had power to deliver them. But even if he didn't, they wouldn't betray their faith. The king grew even angrier. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter. The soldiers tied up the young men and threw them into the fire. The heat was so intense it killed the soldiers who threw them in. It seemed all was over. But what happened next was an astonishing miracle. The king rose from his throne and looked into the furnace. What he saw left him speechless. Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire? He asked. Yes, king, his officers replied. Then why do I see 4 men walking unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods? God himself had entered the fire to protect them. When the king called them out, they emerged without a single burn. They didn't even smell like smoke. King Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth, had to acknowledge the true God's power. Here's the lesson. Sometimes God allows us to go through the fire, but he never leaves us alone. He's with us in the trial. If you stand firm in faith, you'll see his glory. What seemed like destruction becomes a stage for your miracle. What seemed like the end becomes a new beginning. God honors those who honor him. His power manifests when you trust him, even when everything's against you. But there's more. The next story shows how prayer can open heaven and turn impossibilities into miraculous realities. Imagine facing an impossible situation. No way out, no human solution. Everything tells you there's no hope. What would you do? For many, prayer is the last resort. But in the Bible, one man made prayer his most powerful weapon and saw God move extraordinarily. His name was Daniel. Daniel was God's man in a foreign land, taken captive to Babylon as a youth. His faithfulness brought him royal favor. He became one of the kingdom's highest officials. This aroused other officials' envy. They wanted to destroy him. But there was a problem. Daniel was blameless. They couldn't accuse him of corruption or wrongdoing, so they devised a plan. They knew Daniel had one unbreakable habit. He prayed to God 3 times daily. Always, no matter what. They convinced King Darius to make a law. For 30 days, no one could pray to any god or person except the king. Disobedience meant being thrown to the lions. Daniel heard the decree. He knew what it meant. His life was at risk, but he didn't change his routine, didn't hide his faith. He went to his room, opened his windows toward Jerusalem, and prayed as always. His enemies saw and rushed to accuse him. King Darius valued Daniel, but the law couldn't be changed. With great sorrow, he ordered Daniel thrown to the lions. That night, the king couldn't sleep. He worried about Daniel. At dawn, he rushed to the den and shouted, "Daniel, serving the living God, has your God delivered you?" Then a voice came from the den. "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. They haven't hurt me, because I was found innocent before him." The king rejoiced and ordered Daniel's release. Not a single scratch. God had intervened. Here's the lesson. When you're faithful to God, he's faithful to you. When you trust him in trials, he protects you. Daniel didn't hide, didn't let fear stop him. He knew his God was greater than any threat. God answered his faith. Maybe you feel surrounded by lions today. Maybe traps have been set against you. But if you stand firm, if you seek God in prayer, you'll see him move. He can shut mouths, silence accusations, deliver you from impossibilities. God remains the same. Daniel's God is your God. He's powerful. He's faithful. He won't abandon you in trials. But there's more. The next story shows how God doesn't just rescue you from trials, but gives unexpected victory over enemies. Imagine facing an enemy much greater than you, stronger, better equipped. Everyone says you can't win. What would you do? Flee, surrender, or trust God against all odds? This is a young man who dared trust God and saw impossibilities become reality. His name was David, youngest of 8 brothers. While his brothers went to war, he tended sheep. But one day everything changed. The Philistines, Israel's enemies, sent their champion to defy God's army. His name was Goliath, a nearly 10-foot tall giant, fully armored, wielding a massive sword and spear. For 40 days, morning and evening, Goliath shouted, "Who dares fight me? If someone defeats me, we'll serve you. But if I win, you'll be our slaves." No one dared face him. King Saul and all his soldiers were terrified. Then David arrived at camp. He wasn't a soldier, just bringing food to his brothers. But when he heard Goliath defying God and his people, something burned within him. He said, "Who is this pagan Philistine to defy the armies of the living God?" Soldiers laughed at him. His eldest brother scolded him. "What are you doing here? You're just a shepherd." But David didn't listen to the criticism. He stood before King Saul and said, "I will go fight this giant." Saul laughed. "You're just a boy, and he's been a warrior since his youth." But David responded with unshakable faith. "When I tended my father's sheep, lions and bears came to attack them, and God gave me strength to defeat them. The same God who delivered me from them will deliver me from this giant." Saul, with no other options, agreed. He gave David his armor. But David refused it. He didn't need a sword. He didn't need armor. He only needed his trust in God. He took 5 stones from the river and with a sling, walked onto the battlefield. Goliath looked at him and mocked. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" David wasn't intimidated, and he responded with courage. "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, whom you have defied. Today, God will deliver you into my hands." The giant advanced. David ran toward him. He took a stone, placed it in his sling, and launched it with all his strength. The stone flew and struck Goliath in the forehead. The giant fell to the ground. The Philistine army was in shock. David ran, took the giant's sword, and beheaded him. The enemy had been defeated, and all Israel celebrated the victory. Here's the lesson. No matter how big your problem is, no matter how impossible the battle seems, God doesn't need swords or spears to give you victory. He only needs someone who trusts in him. David didn't win because he was the strongest. He won because he put his confidence in God. Maybe today you're facing a Goliath in your life, a problem that seems too big, an enemy that seems impossible to defeat. But remember this, if God is with you, it doesn't matter who's against you. If God has called you, it doesn't matter how many criticize you. The same God who brought down Goliath can bring down any obstacle in your life. He fights your battles, and he always has a final word. But there's still more. In the next story, you'll discover how God not only gives you victory, but also restores you when you feel you've fallen too low. Imagine you failed. Not a small mistake, not a simple error, but a total failure. You feel you've disappointed God, that you've lost everything, that there's no way back. What would you do? This is the story of someone who was at the top and fell to the lowest point of his life. But God didn't leave him there. This is Peter's story. Peter wasn't a perfect man. He was impulsive, spoke without thinking, and often let his emotions lead him. But there was something in him that Jesus loved. Peter had passionate faith. When Jesus called him to leave his nets and follow him, Peter didn't hesitate. He left everything and became one of Jesus' closest disciples. He saw Jesus walk on water. He saw incredible miracles. He heard words that changed his life. And one day, Jesus made him a promise. "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Peter was meant to be a pillar in God's plan. But then everything collapsed. The night before the crucifixion, Jesus told his disciples they would all abandon him. Peter felt offended. "No, Lord, even if everyone else leaves you, I never will." Jesus looked at him with love and said, "Peter, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter couldn't believe it. He would never do that. Or at least, that's what he thought. That night, Jesus was arrested. Peter followed at a distance. But while in the high priest's courtyard, someone recognized him. "You were with Jesus." Peter felt fear. "No, I don't know him." Minutes later, another person pointed at him. "Yes, you're one of them." Peter denied more forcefully. "No, I don't know him." Finally, a third person accused him. Your accent gives you away. You're a Galilean. Peter, desperate, began to curse and swear. I don't know that man. At that instant, the rooster crowed. Peter looked up and saw Jesus, who was being led away by the soldiers. Their eyes met. Peter felt his world shatter into pieces. He ran away and wept bitterly. He had failed. He had denied his Lord. Could God forgive him? Was there still hope for him? Peter spent days in deep sadness. But then the unthinkable happened. Jesus rose from the dead. And by the Sea of Galilee, Peter had an encounter that would change his life forever. Jesus called him. He asked him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? Peter, with tears in his eyes, responded, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus told him, feed my sheep. Jesus didn't just forgive Peter. He restored him. He gave him a new chance. He reminded him that his failure wasn't the end, that he still had a purpose. Peter, the man who denied Jesus, became a leader of the early church. He preached boldly, and his testimony changed history. Here's the lesson. No matter how much you failed, no matter how low you've fallen, God isn't finished with you. He doesn't define you by your worst mistake. He sees you through his grace. Maybe today you feel like Peter. Maybe you think there's no hope left for you. But God tells you, I still have a plan for you. If you come to him, if you give him your heart, he will restore you. He can turn your failure into a new beginning. Peter's story didn't end in denial. It ended in redemption. And yours can too. But there's still more. In the next story, you'll discover how God can use you to do greater things than you ever imagined. No matter where you come from or what you've been through. Have you ever felt small? Like you're not good enough, not prepared enough, or not strong enough for what God wants to do in your life? If you've ever doubted yourself, this story is for you. It's the story of a man who thought he was good for nothing, but God looked at him and saw a leader. This is Gideon's story. Israel was in trouble. They had disobeyed God, and as a result, their enemies oppressed them. The Midianites came every year and destroyed their crops, stole their food, took their livestock. The people lived in fear, hiding in caves. And in this chaos, we find Gideon, an ordinary man, without power, without experience, and without self-confidence. When we first meet him, he's hiding. He was threshing wheat in a wine press, a hidden place, because he feared the Midianites. But in that moment, God sent an angel to speak to him. The angel said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon looked around, surprised. Who? Me? I'm no warrior. My family is the weakest in the tribe, and I'm the least in my house. I'm the weakest. I can't do anything. But God didn't see Gideon as he saw himself. God saw what Gideon could become. God told him, "Go in the strength you have. I will be with you, and you will defeat the Midianites as if they were one man." Gideon was full of doubts. He asked for signs. He wanted to be sure it was God speaking, and God, with patience, gave him every sign he asked for. Finally, Gideon obeyed. He gathered an army of 32,000 men to face the Midianites. But God said, "You have too many men. If you win with this army, you'll think it was by your own strength. Reduce them." Gideon let go those who were afraid. 10,000 remained. But God said, "Still too many." Finally, God left Gideon with just 300 men, 300 against an innumerable army. Humanly speaking, it was crazy, but God wanted to show his power. Gideon and his men didn't use swords. They didn't use spears. They only had torches, jars, and trumpets. In the middle of the night, they surrounded the enemy camp. At the sound of the trumpets and the crashing of jars, God sent confusion into the enemy. The Midianites, terrified, began attacking each other. And so, without drawing a sword, Gideon and his small army won. Israel was delivered, all because God took an insecure man, full of fears, and made him a great leader. Here's the lesson. God doesn't choose you for your strength. He chooses you for his purpose. It doesn't matter if you feel weak. It doesn't matter if you think you're not enough. If God is with you, you are more than enough. Maybe today you feel like Gideon. Maybe you think you can't do what God has called you to do. But God doesn't see you as you see yourself. God sees your potential. God sees what you can become in His hands. If you trust Him, He will use you in ways you never imagined. Because with God, victory doesn't depend on numbers or strength. It depends on faith. And if you believe God, He will do impossible things in your life. This is the final message. God has called you, not for who you are today, but for who He knows you can become. Maybe you feel you're not strong enough. Maybe you failed. Maybe you think your problems are too big. But God has shown again and again that He uses the small to bring down giants, that He restores those who have fallen, and that He strengthens the weak. Today, God speaks to you and says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. I uphold you. I fight for you. I will do in you things you can't yet imagine." The question is, are you willing to trust Him? If you are, get ready, because God has a purpose for you, and what's coming in your life will be greater than you ever dreamed.
If this video has touched your heart and has been a blessing to you, we invite you to leave an amen in the comments as a sign of your faith and gratitude. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you won't miss more content that strengthens your spirit. May God always bless you. See you in the next video.